Thank you everyone for attending this evening's lecture. I'm David Gordon in the History Department here at Bowdoin. I want to begin by thanking everyone who has made this lecture possible, especially our brilliant department coordinator, Rebecca Banks, who's done a fantastic job. Is she in the audience? Yeah, maybe. Thank you, Rebecca. But sorry to embarrass you if you're there. But of course also, Mr. Ronald Goltz, who is in the audience, and who established the Alfred E. Goltz Lecture Fund in memory of his father. The fund is used to support a lecture by an eminent historian or humanitarian and forms a much anticipated event on the annual calendar of the History Department. We've had many eminent historians deliver the Goltz Lecture. There have been fewer humanitarians, I suspect. Jacob Dlamini, as you'll soon witness, combines both these roles. Jacob Dlamini grew up in Katlehong to the southeast of Johannesburg, South Africa, in the 1980s, really at the height of apartheid and the struggle against apartheid, about the same time period that I grew up and around 20 miles away. It was thus with great fascination that I read his first book, this wonderfully pink-covered Native Nostalgia, a memoir of his childhood and adolescence which describes some of the same events that shaped my life, even though my experiences of them were quite different. For that 20 miles traversed one of the most formidable barriers ever constructed across a nation. Apartheid ensured that a white youngster from a wealthy Johannesburg suburb like myself would hardly ever meet a working class, a black youngster from a working class background like Jacob, much less understand their lives. By recounting the quotidian joys of childhood, even while experienced in hardship, Jacob's memoir interrogates the moral dilemmas of remembering times of oppression with nostalgia, with fondness. To me, his memoir, which described a life so familiar and so different to my own, put the tragedy of apartheid into sharp focus. After his high school graduation at the end of apartheid in the early 1990s, Jacob worked as a journalist for two prominent South African newspapers, first the Sunday Times and then as a member of the very respected South African daily, The Business Day. He also began studying for his bachelor's degree at the University of Witwatersrand, where he graduated with distinction in 2003. Following Wits, he graduated with 2 master's degrees from Yale University and from the University of Sussex in 2005 and 2008, and this was followed by his doctorate from Yale University. His PhD dissertation recounts the experience of black South Africans at South Africa's premier conservation park, the Kruger National Park, showing how they came to possess a place, a land that had been dispossessed, that had been dispossessed from them and from which they were excluded in many ways. Now, at the same time as writing this dissertation, Jacob wrote a biography about a liberation fighter turned counterinsurgency agent. It was titled Ascaris, a story of collaboration and betrayal in the anti-apartheid struggle. Like his first memoir, Ascaris asked difficult questions. In particular, what motivates someone to fight for the other side? And how do we understand the traitor as a moral agent? Like Native Nostalgia, it complicates apartheid, even while starkly demonstrating divisions in history, and especially in memory, the divisions that still haunt South Africans today. Ascaris was an immediate hit in South Africa, scooping the prestigious Alan Paton Prize for work of nonfiction. The judges of that prize called it an exceptionally brave, groundbreaking book, learned without being ponderous, with an insistent moral compass. Professor Dlamini has held research and teaching positions at the University of Barcelona, the University of Witwatersrand, the New School, and the University of Johannesburg. In 2012, he was awarded an Open Society Fellowship. Last year, Princeton University spotted Jacob's talent and employed him as a professor in African history. It is Bowdoin's great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Dlamini to deliver the annual Goltz Lecture tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. I would like to start by thanking you all for taking the time to come out this evening to hear me lecture. I'd like to thank Professor David Gordon for extending the invitation for me to be here this evening. I'd like to thank both Professor Gordon and Ms. Rebecca Banks for making it possible for me to be here. And finally, I'd like to thank Mr. Galtz for endowing this lecture series and making it possible for me to follow in the footsteps of the amazing scholars and thinkers you've had give talks here before. I have chosen to talk to you about collaboration in apartheid South Africa, and that may sound to some of you like an obscure and esoteric topic, but I want to suggest that the topic is actually not as obscure and esoteric as it might sound. In fact, I want to suggest that the story that I'm going to tell you is in lots of ways your story. It's a story about entangled histories. It's a story about my history as a South African, which is your history as Americans. And I want to show how this story is an entangled history by starting on what will be very familiar terrain to many of you, and that's Washington, D.C. But before I do that, I want to lay out why I want to do it this way, why I want to start on familiar territory, which is Washington, D.C. Why I want to start out in Washington, D.C., as a way of showing you why this is an entangled history, a history that's both mine but also yours. I want to do this because I want to raise a few questions, for you to ponder. The first question has to do with the work that we do as historians. If it is true that our histories are entangled, if it is true that my history as a South African is in some ways your history as an American, what ethical implications does it have for us as historians or people trying to do history? That's the first question I pose for you to ponder. And then the second question I pose for you to ponder has to do with your positioning rather as subjects, as citizens. What moral responsibility do you as American citizens bear for histories that happen in other places, histories with which you're entangled, histories with which your own histories are mixed up? These are the two questions I put to you at the start of this talk. So the first one has to do with the ethical implications that come out of global history. If we are committed to histories that are both global, while not collapsing local specificities into some grand narrative, how do we deal with that? And then the second has to do with your position as citizens and moral subjects. What does it mean for the history that happens someplace else to be in some ways your history? What responsibility do you bear as an American citizen? These are the questions. And now to start my story. On March 22nd, 1982, the US Capitol building in Washington, D.C. played host to one of the strangest dramas in the history of Capitol Hill. The stage was room 2228 in the Dixon Senate office building. The cast, an international array of actors from a US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, a politics professor from the University of Kansas, to a former communist, and 3 self-described ex-terrorists from South Africa. The props included an RPG rocket launcher and an AK-47 assault rifle. Directing all this was Jeremiah Andrew Denton, a senator from Alabama. I mean, this was back in the days when you could smoke in the Senate building and in lecture halls too. Denton, a retired rear admiral in the US Navy, had spent 8 years in a prisoner of war camp in North Vietnam. He was a fervent anti-communist. He was also chairman of the US Senate Subcommittee on Security and Terrorism. Denton's committee was a subsidiary of the US Committee on the Judiciary, chaired by Strom Thurmond, the veteran senator for South Carolina. To give Denton's show its proper name, it was in fact a congressional hearing into, and I quote, the role of the Soviet Union, Cuba, and East Germany in fomenting terrorism in Southern Africa. These were heady days in the US and in the world. President Ronald Reagan was into his second year in office. The Soviet Union was under the dying leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, who in fact would be dead by the end of 1982. And the Cold War was going through one of its frostiest phases. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where the Cold War had always been experienced as a hot war, thousands were dying in conflicts of various historical and ideological sorts. Among these areas of the hot war was South Africa, which had been the scene since December 1961 of an armed struggle between an apartheid government bent on preserving white minority rule and an assortment of groupings led by the African National Congress, the ANC, fighting for majority rule and a non-racial democracy. And like many hot wars around the world at this time, the conflict in South Africa had assumed from very early on the divides of the Cold War, with the apartheid government aligned with the US, the UK, and other members of the so-called free world. The ANC, for its part, was allied to the Soviet Union, from where it obtained almost all of its military supplies. But the ANC drew most of its material support from Scandinavian countries such as Sweden. In fact, the anti-apartheid struggle enjoyed popular support in many Western countries, especially on college campuses around the US. Apartheid South Africa was an awkward ally for the US. With the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in 1974 and the demise of Rhodesia in 1980, South Africa was the only country in Africa ruled by a white minority. With the US still dealing with its own history of racial oppression and the successes of the civil rights struggle still a fresh memory in the minds of many Americans, South Africa presented both a special problem as well as a reminder to the US of the US's own sordid history. But South Africa was strategically important, or so many people in the US establishment believed. I should actually point out here that there was no consensus, in fact, within the US government regarding the strategic worth of South Africa. The CIA and the State Department saw South Africa as a political liability, while the US military, which operated a satellite tracking station in South Africa, actually believed that South Africa was worth fighting for. South Africa was indeed mineral rich and sited along one of the most important shipping routes in the world. How then to deal with an ally whose policies were in some ways no different from the policies you had just been forced by the civil rights struggle to abandon? How to deal, in other words, with an ally who exposed you to constant ridicule and charges of hypocrisy by your biggest enemy, the Soviet Union? For people like Jeremiah Denton, the solution was simple. Ignore South Africa's domestic policies and focus instead on the supposed strategic importance of South Africa to the US. As Denton said in his opening remarks at the start of his show, and I quote, "The purpose of these hearings is not to debate the appropriate US policy towards Southern Africa, nor is it our purpose to analyze South African domestic policies. Surely no one on this subcommittee would condone or attempt to justify in any respect policies of racial discrimination in South Africa, the United States, or elsewhere." Close quotes. Denton had to say that. South Africa was truly the political skunk of the world. Not even an ardent right-winger like Denton could afford to be seen to be openly supporting apartheid. He had to say, even if it was in the third person and expressed in the passive voice, that no one would condone or justify apartheid. But even that qualification was not enough for some critics of his show. Joseph R. Biden, senator for Delaware and a member of Denton's subcommittee, absented himself from Denton's hearings with the excuse that, this is Biden, he had Senate business to conduct back in Delaware. Orrin Hatch, Republican senator for Utah, and another member of the subcommittee was also a no-show. The only other member of the subcommittee to attend the hearings was John P. East, senator for North Carolina. Denton and East were close allies of Jesse Helms, also a senator for North Carolina and one of the most conservative members of the US Senate. Helms was also a strong supporter of apartheid South Africa, and in fact one of the few senators in the US to openly express support for apartheid South Africa. Helms's many claims to notoriety included his filibuster of a bill establishing a national holiday in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. The filibuster failed, ultimately. But the hearings that began on March 22, 1982, were Jeremiah Denton's show. That, at least, is what he wanted the American public to believe. He wanted Americans to think that he, and he alone, had scripted and cast the show, and that he had done this for their own good. As he put it in his opening remarks, and I quote, "Americans have only recently begun to understand the strategic, economic, and political importance of Southern Africa to the welfare, indeed the survival of the free world," close quote. The fate of the US and the rest of the free world depended on Southern Africa, but Americans were too ignorant to know this, Danton hinted. And he planned to lift this veil of ignorance. Danton wanted Americans to believe that this was his production, but the show that came to be called the Danton Hearings was anything but. It was, in fact, a co-production staged by Danton and the South African government, especially its intelligence agencies. The South Africans had hosted a few months earlier Danton's aides in South Africa, taking them around on a tour of South African battlefields and introducing them to individuals and groupings that only had nice things to say about South Africa. The South Africans had also provided Danton with a list of characters to use in his production. They had decided for Danton which South Africans could appear before his subcommittee and what each witness could or could not say. Among Danton's witnesses was Nokonono Delphine Kave, a 28-year-old South African woman who had defected from the ANC. Kave, who had been sent by the ANC to the Soviet Union for study, claimed to have been drugged and raped by members of the KGB while in the Soviet Union. Kave seemed keen to emphasize that her rapists were white men, that the ANC had in fact allowed white men to prey on her. Then there was Bartholomew Tlhapane, who was 64 at the time he appeared before Danton. And that's him there taking the oath before he testified. And Tlhapane was a former executive member of the ANC and the South African Communist Party. Tlhapane told Danton's hearing a story of conversion, claiming that white communists had duped him in 1954 into joining the Communist Party. But Tlhapane told the commission, led by hearing, that he had seen the error of his ways. He had come to realize that white communists were not interested in the lot of black South Africans, that these whites were in fact lackeys of the Soviet Union, using black South Africans to hand South Africa over to the Soviet Union. Another witness to appear before Danton was Jeffrey Busicho, 23 at the time. Busicho was a former member of the ANC, and here he is at the hearing holding an RPG rocket launcher. Asked by Danton to demonstrate how the RPG worked, Busicho replied, quote, "Unfortunately, we do not have a rocket here," close quote. And he said this to much laughter from the audience. Ephraim Falapita, 29 years old at the time, was another of Danton's characters. And here he is demonstrating how to assemble and disassemble an AK-47 assault rifle. Just bear in mind that this drama is taking place on the Senate floor, the floor of the subcommittee. To give you a flavor of the kinds of questions that Danton asked his witnesses, here is Danton asking Falapita, this guy here, a question about the AK-47. Quote, "It is my understanding that this weapon is made in Czechoslovakia, but you got it in East Germany. Is that right?" Close quote. And Falapita answers in the affirmative. What Danton did not say, what he could not say, was that at least two of his witnesses, Jeff Busicho, this gentleman here, and Ephraim Falapita, were in fact members of an apartheid death squad responsible for the deaths of many anti-apartheid activists. Busicho and Falapita were part of a secret group of former freedom fighters who had switched sides in the apartheid conflict and were now working for the apartheid state. They were called Ascaris, an Arabic term for soldier brought to South Africa via a network of counterinsurgencies stretching back to German and British colonialism in East Africa and the Zimbabwean War of Independence in Rhodesia. It is unlikely that Danton, to be fair to him, knew the details of what Busicho and Falapita did in the service of the apartheid government. But I want to believe that he must have known that these witnesses were not some simple black South Africans who had been duped by white communists in the pay of the Soviet Union. I want to believe that he must have known that these are not innocents come to Washington, D.C. to bear witness to the perfidy of the Soviet Union. Bosego, Mfalapitsa, and Tlapane were in fact collaborators. They were former freedom fighters in the struggle against apartheid who had switched sides for various reasons and were now fighting for the apartheid government against their former comrades. By a collaborator, I mean that these individuals began their political lives on one side of the conflict in South Africa and ended it on another. They had turned, to use a colloquial expression. From having taken an oath of loyalty to the ANC, and from having vowed to give their lives in pursuit of freedom, they had now become defenders of apartheid. And that defense took many forms. Overtly, Ascaris like Mfalapitsa and Bosego testified in open court and in public fora, such as Danton's hearings against their former comrades. Covertly, they hunted down their former comrades for capture, torture, and assassination. Yeah. Let us pause here to consider the definition of a collaborator that I've just given you. I have suggested to you that a collaborator is one who abandons one cause for another. This raises the question, why? Why do individuals turn? In his essays on how the French lived under Nazi occupation, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre suggests, among other things, that individuals become collaborators out of a certain psychological weakness. Others who have studied the phenomenon of collaboration in places such as China, Manchukuo, and the Japanese collaboration suggest that individuals collaborate out of a cynical pragmatism, best exemplified by the cliche, if you can't beat them, join them. None of these attempts at answering the question why people collaborate is satisfactory, as you no doubt will agree. Sartre's definition, for example, assumes a psychological disposition that makes it a given that people will collaborate. In truth, collaborators come in many guises. Collaboration itself exists on a continuum defined by extremes and a range of complexities in the middle. In fact, collaboration is far more common in human conflict than we are willing to admit. From informers, snitches, spies, to groups like the Ascaris I'm talking about, collaborators occur far more frequently than we care to admit. And here are just some examples that I want to share with you. And I draw these examples from a wonderful, wonderful book by a historian named Steve Hewitt. The book is called Snitch, A History of the Modern Intelligence Informer. In explaining just how common the phenomenon of collaboration is in its various guises, Hewitt points out, for example, that between 1979 and 1981, the Irish Republican Army killed at least 7 of its members. And in fact, infiltration by collaborators inside the IRA was so bad that the IRA actually had to declare an amnesty, saying to its members, if you are collaborating with the British, please come clean. We won't kill you. And of course, that didn't work. Between 1987 and 1993, for example, 1,000 Palestinians were executed by their own side for being informers. And of course, this is quite interesting to think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is often described in apocalyptic terms, as a fight to the death. Yeah. But if collaboration is so common, what does that tell us about the possibility of finding a solution? That is not apocalyptic in its term. And of course, let's not assume, just based on the figures that Hewitt gives us, that the phenomenon of collaboration is something that's reserved only for conflict-ridden societies. In the US itself, we have cases of collaboration. So for example, in the 1950s, this is from Hewitt, 20% of the members of the Communist Party of the USA were actually informers for the FBI and other state agencies. In the 1960s, Hewitt says that 17%, that is 1,500 out of 8,000 members of the Communist Party of the United States, were actually informers. In 1965, this again is from Hewitt, 6% of the members of the Ku Klux Klan were actually FBI and government informers. In 1967, the FBI started what's called the Ghetto Informant Program, whereby it trained and sent out 7,000 informers across Black America. Yeah, and there are even suggestions, again this is from Hewitt, that Ronald Reagan himself might have actually worked as an informant for the FBI in the 40s and 50s. And he's not unique in this. Other names that have come up in the context of collaboration and informing, and I am aware that I'm using the words collaborator and informer interchangeably, and we can talk about that at the discussion time. Walt Disney, Joseph P. Kennedy, Abe Fortas, the Supreme Court Justice, Henry Kissinger, William F. Buckley, and George Orwell are just some of the names that have been associated in different ways with collaboration. In the Soviet Union itself, which is a famous case, of course, of massive collaboration, we are told that in the 1930s, at least 10% of Soviet citizens were informers. Yeah. What is the problem with this? What is the problem with collaboration? Hewitt points out that one of the problems with collaborators, one of the problems with informers is that they not only pollute the public world, but they also show the limits of state surveillance and state involvement. Now, to get back to the story that I am trying to tell you about, the Denton hearings. The four witnesses that I've shown to you and described to you, Kave, Tlapane, Bosego, and Falapitsa, were the only South Africans to appear before Denton's commission. And it was no accident that all four were black. In fact, the four were in the employ of the South African security agencies, literally drawing salaries from these agencies. They had been flown to Washington, D.C. by South African intelligence to show the evil of the Soviet Union. And you might actually, I'm sorry that these are such bad, bad pictures, but you might notice that, both Bosego and Mfalapi is actually wearing the same suit, bought for them by their masters, no doubt. Yeah, and these four, were taken to D.C. specifically to testify to the perfidy, as I've said, of the Soviet Union. And of the four witnesses, only Tlapane, Bosego, and Falapitsa seemed to have been genuine defectors from the ANC. Kave seems to have been an apartheid agent all along, used by the apartheid intelligence agencies to infiltrate the activist circles around Steve Biko, the charismatic leader of the Black Consciousness Movement who was murdered by the police in 1977 while in detention. Kave was related to two prominent collaborators under apartheid. One was Lennox Serbe, who was head of a Bantustan or a homeland called Saskai, and the other was Charles Serbe, who was related to Lennox Serbe and was in fact head of the intelligence services of this Bantustan. It seems likely that after infiltrating Biko's network and in the process establishing her legend as an activist, Kave was sent out by her handlers to infiltrate the anti-apartheid networks, fast gaining in strength outside South Africa, especially after June 1976. This was after thousands of young, mainly black South Africans fled into exile to escape government's repression of a student uprising that had broken out in Soweto in June 1976 and then spread to other parts of South Africa. So how did the three men, Tlapane, Bosego, and Falapitsa, become collaborators? Of the three, Tlapane had been active in the ANC and SACP underground when he was arrested in June 1963. He was put in solitary confinement under a new law that had just been introduced as part of a massive crackdown of opposition to apartheid. The law placed him in solitary confinement for 3 months. During his 3 months in solitary confinement, he was tortured so severely that he suffered serious psychological difficulties and had to seek counseling upon his release. He was detained again in 1964 and placed in solitary confinement, this time for 2 months. In 1966, he was again arrested under the same 90-day law and placed in solitary confinement for 3 months. This last stretch finally broke him, and he agreed to serve as a state witness in a number of political trials involving former comrades. By the time he arrived in D.C. to take part in Denton's show, he had been working for South African security services for 16 years and had helped put many of his former colleagues in jail. Among those he testified against was Bram Fischer, a celebrated lawyer and the son of a prominent Afrikaner family who had abandoned his community and found common cause with South Africa's black majority. In fact, ANC assassins caught up with Tlapane in December of 1982, that is 9 months after his appearance before Denton's commission. They killed him and his wife. If Bartholomew, and please forgive me if I sound like I approve, I actually don't approve of his assassination. If Dlamini came to Danton's show via detention and torture, Bosiko and Mfalapitsa seem to have taken slightly different routes. It is not clear how Bosiko ended up on the apartheid side, but it seems he defected sometime between 1980 and 1982 after falling out with his comrades in the ANC. Yeah. Thanks to the South African Truth Commission, we know a lot about how Mfalapitsa, this man here, ended up disassembling and assembling an AK-47 in front of 2 US senators on Capitol Hill. When Mfalapitsa appeared before Danton's commission in March of 1982, he had been a defector for just 3 months. Mfalapitsa had abandoned his ANC post in Botswana in December of 1982 and immediately joined the South African Security Police. But because he was so new, he had to prove his loyalty to his new masters, and he had to do that in the most lethal way possible. He had to betray someone very close to him. He, in fact, betrayed a close family friend and 2 comrades to the security police. What happened was that Mfalapitsa was approached by this family friend and 2 of his friends. They didn't know that he defected, and these 3 asked him for help because they wanted to go into exile so they could take up arms and come back and fight against the government. Mfalapitsa so knew as a defector that he thought that this was a trap by his new masters to test his loyalty. So he reported the 3 to his new masters. And the masters, who actually had no interest in arresting the 3, which they could have done. You couldn't leave the country legally in South Africa under apartheid. So the police could have arrested the three men, but they didn't do that. In fact, they were boys, they were aged 18 and under. But the police had no intention of arresting the 3. So what they then did was they instructed Mfalapitsa to lure the 3 boys to a disused mine shaft west of Johannesburg and to pretend to offer them training, but instead to give them booby-trapped hand grenades. Mfalapitsa did as instructed, took the 3 boys to this disused mine shaft, gave them rudimentary training, and then gave them these booby-trapped hand grenades, told them what to do, and just said to them, I'm just going to get some more weapons, continue with the exercise, I'll be back. And of course, they did as instructed. The bombs exploded. 2 of them died instantly. The family friend survived, but just barely, and he was promptly arrested and sent to prison, which is actually how we know about what Mfalapitsa did. And for his troubles, Mfalapitsa received a 1,000 rand bonus and new clothes for the mission. Mfalapitsa and his police masters applied to the Truth Commission in 2000 for amnesty for what they had done. But the application was denied. That is how Ascaris like Mfalapitsa operated, pretending to be freedom fighters while in fact in the employ of the apartheid government. Oftentimes, Ascaris helped the police detect former comrades. Sometimes they led death squads and killed or helped kill people opposed to apartheid. We have accounts, for example, of Bosiko traveling to Swaziland to hunt down former ANC comrades. We have TRC testimony, that's the Truth Commission, from Mfalapitsa himself about his role in the murders of ANC members. As we know from the case of Dlamini outlined above, the South African security establishment began using torture in the early 1960s to turn activists and then to use them against their former comrades. But Bosiko and Mfalapitsa were in a slightly different category. They were part of a structured and specialized program of collaboration intended to turn people like Mfalapitsa into special forces for the South African Security Police. The program began proper in 1979 and drew from the experience of a number of counterinsurgencies around the world, from the British in Malaya and Kenya, the Americans in Vietnam, the French in Algeria, and of course the Portuguese and Rhodesians in Southern Africa. What these counterinsurgencies taught the South Africans was that you could use captured freedom fighters or defectors to great effect against their former comrades. And so they did, using them to go against ANC people and other anti-apartheid activists. By the 1990s, Eugene de Kock, whose picture I'll show you towards the end, the man who commanded Ascaris for almost 10 years, was busy turning Ascaris into a paramilitary force. Eugene de Kock was so convinced, in fact, I have his image here. Yeah, this is Eugene de Kock here. Eugene de Kock was so convinced that South Africa was headed for civil war in the 1990s that he was preparing for war. And here images of some of these Ascaris. An image of some of these Ascaris, being given training as parabets. Yeah, that's a picture of an Ascari. And this is a group of Ascaris after their training in paramilitary tactics. So far, I've only sketched the spectacular side of collaboration. I've given you only the most dramatic sketch involving people like Mfalapitsa. The truth is that Ascaris were in fact a small segment of the people involved in collaboration in apartheid South Africa. We have fastened on them because their cases seem relatively easy. That is, their cases seem to represent a straightforward case of individuals who began their political lives fighting on one side, but ended up fighting on the other. Shame might attend Ascaris, and they may live in the shadows, but they do not trouble us much. Their numbers are so small, an estimated 300 over a 14-year period, that we can safely cast them aside. But what about the thousands of South Africans, especially black South Africans, who collaborated in one form or another with the apartheid state? What about the thousands of black teachers who seem to have had no qualms about feeding the inferior education set aside for black children by the apartheid government to their students? What about the thousands of black policemen and women who served in various sections of the South African police, including its death squads? And what about the thousands of black people who staffed apartheid's bureaucracies? How are we to think about them? How are we to think about them in relation to our efforts to forge a democratic, non-racial, and open society in South Africa? When communism collapsed in the former Soviet bloc, countries such as Czechoslovakia adopted what they called lustration, a policy whereby those who had collaborated with the Soviet regimes were purged from the public sphere. The process was uneven and subject to corruption, but it did keep some check on who could and could not serve in the bureaucracy of the new state. In the former East Germany, public servants, including teachers who had collaborated with the communists, were barred from public service. There again, the process was uneven, it was unfair in places, but it had a deterrent effect. It's been 21 years since the end of apartheid, and South Africa has yet to reckon fully with the legacy of its authoritarian past. More than 2 decades after the advent of democracy in South Africa, only one senior official of the old order has spent time in prison for crimes committed on behalf of the old order. And that's this man here. Eugene de Kock remains the only high-ranking member of the apartheid regime to have gone to jail for crimes committed for apartheid. And even then, the judge who found him guilty was careful to say, it's not because of what you did in your official capacity, but what you did in your spare time that I'm sending you to jail. Yeah, incidentally, he's just come out on parole after spending 21 years in jail. Sure, South Africa had the much vaunted Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it seems to have had a limited effect when it comes to prosecuting past crimes. So a good example, for example, so I have Mfalapitsa here testifying before Denton in 1982. This is Mfalapitsa, much older, and incidentally now a pastor in an evangelical born-again Christian church called New Life Ministries, testifying before the Truth Commission. Of course, as I told you, he didn't get amnesty for helping get his family friend killed, but he's still walking around free. He has yet to be charged, and it doesn't look like he's going to be charged anytime soon. Yeah, so South Africa had its Truth Commission, but it seems to have had a limited effect when it comes to prosecuting past crimes. Part of the reason, I would argue, is that the Truth Commission could not deal with the fact that so many apartheid collaborators were in fact black. The Commission is not alone in this. Many South Africans cannot deal with the fact that so many collaborators were black. Yeah. That is why my latest book has been denounced by some as a heretical attempt to suggest that if so many collaborators were black, then surely apartheid could not have been that bad. For the record, I do not make that argument. I would never make that argument. Apartheid was a crime against humanity, as the United Nations correctly determined in the 1970s. It was a crime for which many can and should be punished. But we have not done that, and there is no indication that we will. Why the surprise, then, when our police officers act no differently from the way they acted under apartheid? I'm sure you're aware of the Marikana massacre a few years ago now, where miners protesting against poor pay were gunned down, by the police. And we've just had a commission of inquiry, and it looks like the massacre was actually planned from high up. Yeah. Why the surprise at the level of corruption engulfing South Africa? I wrote about Ascaris in my latest book because they were relatively easy to write about. I wrote about them because their case seemed straightforward. But even then, I tried to make a case for complexity. I tried to show that we cannot judge Ascaris from a position of innocence. We cannot assume that we know and understand why Ascaris became Ascaris, or that confronted with the same choices that led someone like Mfala Pizza, for example, to become an Ascari, we would have acted differently. Or that confronted with the kind of torture that Dlamini was exposed to, we would have chosen and decided differently. But how to write about the more banal and insidious forms of collaboration? That is the challenge that faces us as historians. To conclude, I began this lecture on the floor of the US Capitol building. I did that in part to show you, my American audience, how entangled our histories are. I told you the story about Danton and his witnesses in order to remind you of the wrong choices that many US politicians, especially Ronald Reagan, made in the struggle against apartheid. But I also told you the story of Danton in order to push you to think about the many conflicts in which the US is involved today. Let us take the invasion of Iraq. It has become an article of faith in the US that the so-called surge that subdued the Iraqi insurgency for a while and which allowed the US to withdraw from Iraq with some dignity was due to the genius of General David Petraeus and the additional US troops that he called for. But ask yourself this: why is it that, for all that has been written about the surge, we know next to nothing about the actual mechanics of the surge? We know about Petraeus and his additional troops, but we know nothing about how the surge worked in practice. The reason we know nothing about its mechanics is because the bulk of the fighting under the surge was actually done by Iraqis. It was done in the main by insurgent groups that decided to switch sides, to stop fighting the Americans and to fight other insurgent groups for a number of reasons. Tell this story and the surge becomes less heroic. Petraeus, less of a genius. Tell the story and the Iraqis who fought their own begin to look less like freedom fighters. Who wants that story told? Not the Americans who insist on the exceptionalism of their military prowess. Certainly not the Iraqis who want the world to believe that they and they alone liberated their country from both Saddam Hussein and the Americans. Who in South Africa wants to be reminded that for millions of black South Africans, the face of apartheid was black, not white? Not many. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Does the story you tell about collaborators, does it require a moral duality? So even in your presentation, and I think you want to disrupt a moral duality, but it sounds like your presentation rests upon the existence of a good side and a bad side. But your presentation actually disrupts that by showing that there could be multiple sides, depending on people's experience and depending on the political outcomes that they want to achieve. So I have a scholarly question with respects to the historical story that you tell, but I guess also a personal or individual question for how you wrestle with the muddled nature of the reality that you recreate through history.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's something I grapple with. Actually, I had an exchange with a student a few days ago, who accused me, on the basis of the same conversation, who accused me of moral absolutism, suggesting that I was despite my attempt at showing the complexity of the phenomenon of collaboration, that I was too stark in my judgments. And my answer to that, very difficult question is that I want us to be able, at the end of the day, so I should not show this man again, that I want us to be able at the end of the day to judge this man, right? To say that he's betraying of his family friend, because that's what he did, and he did it consciously. That his betraying of his family friend is wrong, and that we need to hold him accountable for that as a moral agent. I want to be able to make that argument, but I don't know how else to make that argument unless I insist on the difference between right and wrong. Yeah, because part of what I'm trying to do is to say, well, I understand, and I chose him in some ways because he's a bit of an easy case in that he defects. He gets sick of the ANC. He gets fed up with life in exile and says, I want to go home. And he literally just walks into a police station and say, I'm here. So I choose him in some ways because he's a relatively easy case. I mean, I know he's not. I know he's not. But I guess that's what I need help with. That how then are we? From what ground can we then say, well, what you did, selling out your family friend, was wrong, unless we insist on some distinction between right and wrong? How do we say, well, we understand why collaborators collaborate, while still insisting at the same time that we want to reserve the right to pass judgment. Yeah, but not from a position of innocence, not from a position of. It's not about occupying a moral high ground, but it's about I don't know, just being able to say, well, people who worked with Nazis collaborated, and that's wrong, and that they need to be held accountable for that. In Chile under Pinochet, that people who worked with Chile's secret police against their former friends, did wrong, and we need to say that. I don't know how to say that. My answer is muddled because my thinking is muddled on this.
What percentage of South Africans were politicized during the whole struggle in general? And what would make somebody want to become part of one side or the other? And it's sort of a general question, but how many people really would want to take up arms for one side or the other, and would be able to, afford to do so?
Yeah. Again, another difficult question, but thanks. So very few. Very few South Africans actually took up arms. So at its height, the ANC in exile had. This was the police estimate, because they kept tabs on the ANC, because you need to know your enemy, right? The police, I think, calculated at one stage that the ANC had no more than 12,000 members in exile. Yeah, but of the 12,000, very few were actually capable of bearing arms. And in the camps, I think I want to say maybe 7,000. Received some sort of military training, but of those, very few, could be deployed inside South Africa. Yeah. So yeah, and then in South Africa itself, this is. So my book, in some ways, was an attempt to deal with this. That very few Black South Africans were politically engaged. Very few, and in fact, many of them just made do. Many of them just lived. This doesn't say that this doesn't mean that they endorsed the system. This doesn't mean that they supported apartheid. They didn't. But people just lived despite it. They found ways to exist despite apartheid. Yeah. And this has become important as a point worth making, because we've now seen over the last 20 years this attempt to suggest that every Black person in South Africa is by definition a freedom fighter. That somehow we're all involved in the struggle, which is just not true. Yeah, I'm not answering your question, but I hope that.
Thank you.
Hope that helps.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. Could you walk us through the distinction you're making between, and my colleague and I were sort of whispering a little bit about, the distinction between a collaborator and a traitor, on the other hand. There's something about using the term collaborator centers or privileges the white power structure, and whereas the traitor term might privilege the black freedom fighters in a way. So just give a sense of how you're thinking of that term, if you could.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, these aren't easy questions. Yeah. So I've been, you know, so in the book Ascaris, for example, I'm very careful about using the word, treachery. Oh, sorry, the words treachery, traitor, because I think those words are by definition judgmental. There's a certain privileging that goes on in that choice of words, and I use collaborator because as I don't know, as simple as it sounds, right? As weak as it is as a label, I think it does more work in capturing some of the complexity. Because I think a traitor comes, has within it already this judgment that I'm grappling with, whereas collaborator doesn't necessarily. I don't think I'm answering your question, so I don't use the word traitor or the word treachery. I use collaborator because it's more capacious, I think, and less judgmental. Yeah, and not satisfactory, but yeah.
Hey, thanks for coming. My question is connected to the final statement you made about these collaborators or these people being more like the black face of apartheid. And I'm going to continue your metaphor of a face. And so I'm thinking of them like in relationship to the brain or like the white power structure that has these orders of exacting apartheid. And so from what I'm listening to your lecture, it seems more like these people, these collaborators were like the hands of apartheid, and whereas the face with proximity to the brain would be still white because they are, doing the dirty work, but they're not necessarily making those decisions about, oh yeah, I'm gonna go kill my friends. He still took the order from the master. So is that accurate to say that they're more like tools of the master's will rather than like the mask of apartheid?
Yeah, another difficult question. Yeah. So here's the here's the difficulty, right, about South Africa. I mean, as you know, the racial ratio in South Africa is 1 to 10. So for every 10 people of African descent, there's one person of European descent, and of course it gets complicated because you also have people of Indian descent, and you have people of mixed descent. But what that ratio should tell you is that white South Africans just never had the numbers on their own. They just never had the numbers to make colonialism work, to make apartheid work. That it was always a collaborative. Collaborative venture. Does that mean that power always resided ultimately in some white power structure? I don't know. Maybe, but I'd like to think it was more complex than that. That in fact you had a lot of so part of what I'm trying to grapple with here, black people who not out of I don't know, coercion, become collaborators. So people who have no problem with apartheid, will happily work for a death squad and go out and kill people, right? That's what I'm trying to understand. So what's the motivation here? And it goes back, I think, to thinking politically about subjectivity, about citizenship. That a lot of these people who happily joined the police force, didn't do it because they needed the money. They did it because they believed in, at some level, in apartheid, right? They believed in that project. They believed that there was something, in there for them. It's an ugly thing to say, right? Because what are we suggesting? That the people who, black people who are buying, into white supremacy, that's the implication, unfortunately. But what I'm trying to grapple with is at these cases, I'm going for the easy cases here, right? Because this is a more straightforward story to tell in some ways. But the story that I'm actually struggling to tell is the one, about, black people working with the colonial power structure and making it function, not as hands, not as tools, but as active agents. right? I'm also trying to work with the idea that for the average black South African, apartheid had a black face. You needed a document to move from A to B, and who issued that document? It was black clerks, right? Who made the system work? It was black clerks. Yeah, because I could flip your question and say, well, why didn't those black clerks just work slowly from inside? Issue the wrong document or sabotage the machines. They didn't, right? Yeah, I don't know if I'm taking a cheap shot, but I'm that's what I'm trying to get at.
Any case of collaborators in the other direction?
Well, actually, yeah, that's a good one. So we have the most famous case is of a man named Dirk Coetzee. Dirk Coetzee, in fact, preceded this guy as head of this death squad, but it's a weird, strange, bizarre case. So Dirk Coetzee, yeah. So the apartheid government, I mean, it was quite complex. It was many things, right? And it was quite happy to kill opponents. But the one thing that it wouldn't abide, well, one of the many things it wouldn't abide were officers, of his caliber watching porn, for example. So Dirk Coetzee is actually fired from his job because he's caught with porn. But not just watching porn, but distributing porn around his colleagues. And then remember, these are all death squad members, right? These are people whose job is to kill people. And the government has no problem with that. But the moment you start watching pornography, suddenly you've crossed the line. So Dirk Coetzee gets fired. He gets fired, and of course the way that they fire him, they send him. They send him to some far-off post, in some obscure part of the country, and he's bitter. And he's bitter about this because he sees himself as actually one of the best members of the police force. In fact, he boasts. He died recently of cancer, but he boasts about how he got the highest grades at the police college. That he was the best graduate the police college had ever had. And so he starts. So he gets fired in 1983. So from '83, he starts trying to sell his story to anyone who will listen. That hey, I'm part of a death squad. How found this death squad? No one is interested. And it's not until much later, when the dam starts breaking, that he's able to go to the ANC. So he crosses over to the other side. But even that is just to save himself. Because his friends want to kill him. Because they know that he's been trying to flog the story. And that for the first time, we're talking 1987, 88, that for the first time there's an audience for him. So he's a collaborator who goes in the opposite direction, in that sense. And then there's a case that's a bit obscure of a guy called Ronald Bezuidenhout, Afrikaans, who's in the apartheid military, and then goes into exile to join the ANC. But it's not clear because he defects back to the military. So it's not clear if he was an agent all along or if he had a change of heart twice over. Yeah. So you have cases like that, but none of them is a simple case. Yeah.
You made reference to the third major racial group in South Africa, South Asians, who suffered by apartheid as well, although not to the same degree as Africans.
If we're talking, sorry to correct you, if we're talking numbers, then there'll be the fourth. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
What's the third?
It'll be people of mixed descent.
Well, okay, but from a legal perspective, weren't they all lumped into the middle ground? Okay, well, that's my ignorance.
In fact, there's a. Sorry. Yeah.
Anyway, my question is, did any of that group function as collaborators?
Not as a group. Not as a group. So one of the ironies about the apartheid struggle or the anti-apartheid struggle is that given the different levels of education among the different groups. So if you were white and you went to a white government school, you got the Rolls Royce of education. If you were this was a gradation. So white, you got the Rolls Royce. Indian, you got, I don't know, maybe Mercedes, right? If you're colored, so someone of mixed descent, you got a Toyota, right? And then if you were someone of African descent, you got a jalopy. right? That could barely function. But what this meant in practice was that especially if you were middle class and came from the top 3 communities, you were better educated on average. You could negotiate your way around the world. So what ended up happening is that a lot of the intellectuals and the anti-apartheid struggle ended up de facto coming from these communities. And that created its own forms of resentment. But as a group, you can't say that colored people collaborated, Indian people collaborated. They didn't. In fact, you had a disproportionate number of colored people in the anti-apartheid struggle. Same with Indian people. And among white South Africans, it's actually very interesting because there's a disproportionate number of Jewish South Africans who, in fact, almost all of them of that generation actually happened to be children of immigrants, who'd come to South Africa escaping the pogroms in Russia, with very fresh memories of what it means to be victimized on the basis of ethnicity or your background. Yeah. So I mean, as a group, no, I wouldn't say that colored people collaborated or Indian people collaborated. Yeah. There's actually, so while we take that, there's actually a great poem from South Africa called The Chameleon Dance. I don't know, David, if you ever taught that poem. It's actually a poem, but in actual fact, it's a government report from the year 1987. Because what used to happen in South Africa, I mean, this is one of the great ironies about South Africa. You could actually apply to a government agency to have your race changed. And this poem is a government report for the year 1987, showing you, how many white people applied in that year to change from, white to Indian, white to colored. And people did this for all kinds of reasons. And the final line of this, and this is a government report, which is now a poem. The final line is that no whites became blacks and no blacks became whites. So above, you could move, all kinds of directions, but white and black, no, fixed. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to draw you maybe away from the empirical more to a conceptual ground and maybe cover a lot of the terrain you've already gone over. What does your study here contribute to questions that historians have about debates about agency? Because historians are always looking for agency everywhere. We're going to look at the past. Why isn't there weren't more slave rebellions? Why isn't it the Maroons triumphed in Jamaica? Walter Johnson writes pretty eloquently about this and provocatively in that great article a few years back in Journal of Social History. I'm thinking here that this really makes a muddle of agency, because if we go back to your collaborators, we go looking for agency, and it's not particularly a very pretty face that we see if we want to privilege agency as the North Star by which we guide our historical inquiry. Yeah. So can you take that and go with, because I'm thinking here also we're going back to Hitler's willing executioners. We're going back to other times like Soviet collaboration during the Stalinist era. I mean, agency is a pretty fraught enterprise if that becomes the lodestar by which you navigate.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, absolutely. And in fact, I'm glad you raised that question, because in some ways it goes to the question that the gentleman in the hat asked. Yeah, what do we call agency when we don't like the way it looks, right? Because this is the fundamental problem, right? What do you do? And I think it's a serious problem. It really is. Yeah, yeah. It's something that I was trying to understand. That what do you do in that case? Yeah.
To follow up on that question around agency, how do we think about agency in the context of in front of the Senate hearing, and we think about these individuals, and you reference the word master, right? And so I'm sort of torn in terms of thinking about who bought their suits for them. It's one thing to think about them as having masters who did this, and it's another thing to think about them as coordinated, right? These coordinated efforts that sort of gives them a certain level of agency. So I want you to unpack that a little bit for me as I try to figure that out.
No, I mean, yeah. In some ways, this goes back to the very first question, right? So here's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to say to Ephraim Falapita, using a religious idiom, he's now a pastor, right? I want to say to him that what you did was wrong, right? And be consistent in my saying that, right? I want to be able to say that, yeah. But this is where I expose myself to attack. But at the same time, I want to say, well, I can't imagine what you, I mean, I can speculate, but I can't get inside your head and imagine what you went through, what sort of decisions you took when you decided to defect from, this side over to the other side, right? But at the same time, I want to have the ability to hold you morally responsible. Yeah, because I think that's what it boils down to, moral responsibility for our actions. Yeah. Because yeah. And the other thing that I'm trying to avoid, and I feel like some of these questions are pushing me towards this, right, is this heroic narrative of the struggle against apartheid, where, the word traitor is used very liberally, right? And it's used very liberally as a way of saying, well, why didn't they choose death, right? Yeah, but it's never put, as crudely as I'm putting it now. But what often happens is that the question becomes, well, why did he collaborate? Yeah, but the subtext is, well, why didn't he just die, right? Because then, to make life easier for everyone, right? Because then you'd be a hero, right? You'd be the one person who chose death over treachery, right? But I don't know if that's a fair choice. And people want to live. People want to live. We may not like the way they want to live, right? We may not like the way they want to exercise how they live, but they want to live. Yeah, and that's one of the biggest dilemmas in thinking about the struggle for freedom in South Africa. In fact, there's one case I write about in the book. It's of a remarkable woman named Portia Ndwandwe, who's captured, in fact, who's betrayed by a collaborator, betrayed to the South African police, who then kidnap her from Swaziland. And bear in mind that she has a baby who I think is about 2 months old at this time. She thinks she's going out to meet, she's in the ANC underground, she thinks she's going out to meet with a comrade. It turns out the guy has turned and sells her to the South African police, who then take her back to Swaziland, torture her, and then offer her life for collaboration or death for not collaborating. And she chooses, yeah, I mean, this is the conventional narrative, that she chooses death, right? That she chooses heroism, that she doesn't agree to collaborate, and the police kill her and bury her in this unmarked grave. The actual truth is that, through torture, she actually spills a lot of beans, and she actually betrays a lot of people, but because she's tortured, right? It's that final step. In fact, the guy who kills her, the guy who fires a fatal shot, tells the Truth Commission that, she says to me, as she's giving me all this information, she says to me, okay, I'll work for you guys. But the guy knows enough, he's been doing this for a long time. He knows enough, to look out for certain signs, So he tells the Truth Commission later on that so she says she'll work for us, but she doesn't ask, okay, how are we going to contact each other, right? How are you going to make sure that my people in the ANC don't find out that I'm not working for you guys? She doesn't ask any of those questions, And he says we knew then, that she didn't mean it, So he kills her, right? But to hear the ANC tell it, that she's a hero, she chooses death. She doesn't choose death, She tries to get out of it, but the guy knows enough, and he kills her. Yeah. And these are some of the complexities. So I'm trying to move away from this idea that was a choice. Refuse and be a hero and die, or be a morally weak person and collaborate. Because I don't think it's that simple. Yeah.
Doesn't that also get at the question of what is coercion? What is that? It seems to me that that's part and parcel of this. But I actually wanted to ask you if you would return to the issue of informant versus collaborator. You had offered that you might be willing to do that. I'm interested to hear how you're parsing that out. I mean, I've been deliberately clumsy in how I collapse informant, spy, collaborator into just one big whole. But there's a difference, and I think the difference is substantial. So if you read accounts, for example, of how, in light of 9/11, and totally, understandable at one level, why the U.S. government would be hyper vigilant after what happened, on 9/11. But you read accounts of how informants are cultivated and how they're used. I don't think collaborator, as a word there, works. So there's basically is a big difference. But the thing about collaboration also is that, to infiltrate Al Qaeda, right? You're not going to get some random kid from Bowdoin, who grew up in Brunswick, to just show up in Yemen and suddenly, say, "Oh, I'm going to join Al Qaeda," right? Who's going to buy it, right? So you need someone from inside, right? You need to cultivate someone from inside, someone who knows the beast, in a certain sense. So there's that going on. That for things like the surveillance society, to work, you need to cultivate a special kind of collaborator. You need to cultivate informants. And I'm rambling. I'm not answering your question, but there's a difference. There's certainly a difference.
Well, I'm going to bring that to a close. Thank you, Professor Dlamini. That was fascinating, and really appreciated the moral questions that you bring to bear on this very fascinating history. Professor Dlamini will be outside with his book, and I'm sure happy to speak to you and answer any individual questions. Thank you.
Thank you.